What if the most explosive moment in modern diplomacy was not a war, not a coup, not even a secret deal behind closed doors, but a single sentence that silenced presidents, froze journalists mid-keystroke, and sent shockwaves across the globe? What if the entire balance of power shifted at 6:30 in the morning when one young leader dared to ask for respect in front of the world? Would you want to know exactly what happened next? Good day, everyone. Our team would like to warmly welcome you, dear viewers. Imagine this for a moment. What if the most powerful weapon on the world stage was not an army, not a nuclear arsenal, not even a mountain of economic sanctions? What if it was just a single sentence, spoken calmly but firmly, at precisely the right time and place? Most of us believe history shifts only through war, blood, or long treaties written behind closed doors. But on one morning in late August, in a conference hall where nothing extraordinary was expected, the entire rhythm of international politics broke in half. It happened not because of gunfire or marching soldiers, but because one young leader decided that silence had gone on long enough. And in that silence, he had been sharpening his blade. I remember the first time I saw the footage. The hall was filled with the usual chatter, journalists tapping on keyboards, leaders adjusting their ties, translators ready for another routine day of speeches about trade and cooperation. Everything felt ordinary, predictable, forgettable. And then the air changed. A man in uniform walked calmly to the podium. No dramatic gestures, no fiery expressions. Just a gaze directly into the cameras and words delivered so slowly you could feel each syllable echo. He did not shout. He did not bargain. He drew a line so clear that everyone in that room knew nothing would ever be the same. That moment forced me to ask a question I never thought I would ask. What is more terrifying than a threat of war? The answer is a demand for dignity that cannot be negotiated. When Captain Ibrahim Traore looked at the world and said that the Prime Minister of Israel had 48 hours to apologize to Africa or never be welcome again, he was not only addressing one man. He was addressing centuries of insult, decades of being sidelined, years of frustration that had built up across an entire continent. That sentence was a trigger, and like sparks on dry grass, it spread faster than anyone could have imagined. In Johannesburg, in Lagos, in Nairobi, screens replayed the footage on endless loop. In Paris, in Washington, in Beijing, analysts scrambled to understand what had just happened. And online, across every major platform, a single phrase climbed to the very top. Africa is not your pawn. It was more than trending. It was an earthquake. And I could not stop watching, replaying, questioning how such a short moment could turn into something so much bigger. But let me ask you this. Do you think Traore woke up that morning and simply decided to make history on impulse? Or do you believe this was a calculated strike, built on days of silence that were never weakness, but patience? That is the real mystery here. For 4 days, as anger spread over leaked remarks made behind closed doors at the G7, he said nothing. Opponents whispered he was too afraid, that he would let the moment slip by like so many before him. Yet behind that silence, something else was happening. He was not retreating. He was waiting for the stage where the world could not look away. And then he spoke. That is why I believe this story matters. It challenges everything we think about power. Can a leader from a small, landlocked country, often dismissed on the global stage, really command the attention of presidents and prime ministers across the planet with just one sentence? The answer, as the cameras captured it, is yes. And the fact that it happened in our lifetime, before our eyes, makes it impossible to ignore. If you're listening to me right now, I want you to hold that thought. Because what you are about to hear is not simply a headline. It is a shift in the way history is told. For generations, Africa has been spoken about, not spoken to. For years, decisions were made about its future without its voice at the table. And yet here we are, confronted with a moment where one voice forced every microphone, every newsroom, every analyst to stop and listen. That is not just politics. That is transformation. So the question that stays with me, and maybe with you as well, is simple. Was this the reckless gamble of a young leader daring too much? Or was it the birth of a new chapter where Africa refuses to bow, refuses to be silent, refuses to accept anything less than respect? I cannot give you the final answer yet, but I can promise you this. The next few minutes will take you deeper into the drama, the strategy, and the shockwaves of that ultimatum. And when we reach the end, you may see the world a little differently. Our team kindly asks you to support this channel by subscribing. Your support gives us the motivation to bring you more powerful stories like this one, stories that dig beneath the surface and uncover the turning points that shape our time. Stay with us, because what began as one sentence in Addis Ababa might just redefine how the world listens to Africa. What happened in Addis Ababa on that morning in late August can be summed up in less than half a minute, yet its consequences stretched across continents. Picture this. A conference meant for polite speeches about trade and development was suddenly derailed when Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso looked directly into the cameras and declared that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had 48 hours to apologize to Africa or never again be welcome on its soil. One sentence, just one. And in that instant, the hall froze, the chatter died, and history bent toward a new trajectory. Now, I could stop here and tell you it was simply another fiery remark in the world of politics. But if that is all you see, you miss the real story. Because the power of that moment was not only in the words themselves, but in the silence that came before them. For 4 days, while journalists reported leaked comments from a closed G7 meeting where African leaders were described in disparaging terms, Traore said nothing. Social media burned with anger, newspapers ran bold headlines, analysts speculated endlessly, and still he remained quiet. To some, that silence looked like fear. To others, it felt like hesitation. To me, looking back, it was a strategy as sharp as a blade. Think about it. If he had spoken immediately, his words might have been dismissed as reactionary, just another quarrel in the endless cycle of diplomatic disputes. But by waiting, he allowed the outrage to grow. He allowed the story to spread from newsroom to living room, from radio to smartphone. The anger was no longer confined to diplomats. It had become the conversation of millions. And then, when the eyes of the world were already fixed on Africa, he chose his stage. Not a press conference, not a private interview, but the African Development Summit, a gathering broadcast across the globe. He turned what could have been a defensive statement into a bold declaration that shifted the question from whether the leak was true to what Africa would do about it. That is the overlooked detail that fascinates me the most. And let us not forget the context. Those leaked remarks did not emerge in a vacuum. Reports suggested support for harsher financial measures against African nations and the idea of a new global pact that could leave the continent sidelined in future negotiations. For many Africans, it felt like yet another reminder that their voices were treated as expendable. So when Traore finally spoke, he was not just answering an insult. He was channeling years of frustration, years of being told to wait quietly while others decided their future. That is why the hall fell silent. It was not only his ultimatum to one leader, it was the sound of an entire continent demanding to be heard. The hook of the story is not simply that he dared to issue a 48-hour deadline. It is that he weaponized timing itself. His silence was not weakness. It was calculation. His words were not a reaction. They were the culmination of a carefully built stage where the world had no choice but to listen. And the result was something rare in modern diplomacy. Within minutes, news stations from Washington to Paris, from Beijing to Johannesburg, replayed the footage on loop. By midday, the phrase "Africa is not your pawn" was trending across multiple platforms. For the first time in years, the conversation about Africa was not being shaped by external voices. It was being set from within. To me, that is the unusual angle, the side of the story too many skip over. Everyone remembers the ultimatum. But the real genius, the real shock, was how silence transformed into thunder. It was the patience of waiting 4 days, the courage to hold back while the world speculated, and then the precision of choosing the exact stage where those words could no longer be ignored. That is why this was not just a headline. It was a masterclass in turning an insult into an opportunity, in reshaping the narrative by refusing to play on someone else's terms. And so, when I think back to that moment, I do not only recall the ultimatum, I recall the long pause before it. I recall the growing tension, the rising voices online, the sense that something had to break. And then it did. In a hall filled with leaders who expected another routine session, history walked in quietly, spoke a single sentence, and walked out, leaving the world scrambling to understand what had just happened. That, in my eyes, is the deeper truth. The ultimatum was not just about what was said. It was about when, where, and how it was delivered. And that is what turned a short remark into a turning point that no one could ignore. It was just after sunrise in Addis Ababa. The second day of the African Development Summit had begun, and the mood was exactly what you would expect. Delegates shuffled their papers, translators adjusted their headsets, cameras settled into place. Journalists leaned forward over their laptops, already typing out what they thought would be another predictable day of polite speeches on cooperation and growth. Nothing in that room suggested that history was only minutes away. Then the doors at the side of the hall opened, and Captain Ibrahim Traore walked steadily toward the podium. The sound of footsteps against the polished floor cut through the soft murmur of conversations. People turned their heads, expecting yet another address filled with the same diplomatic phrases they had heard 100 times before. But there was something in his demeanor that was different. He did not rush. He did not smile. He carried himself with a calmness that made the air feel heavier with every step he took. When he reached the podium, he paused. For a brief second, all you could hear was the hum of the air conditioning. Then he raised his head, looked directly into the cameras, and began to speak. His voice was even, deliberate, and unshaken. No dramatic gestures, no fiery tone. Each word landed like a hammer strike, slow but undeniable. Mr. Netanyahu, you have 48 hours to apologize to Africa, or you will no longer be welcome here. The hall froze. Journalists stopped typing mid-sentence. Delegates looked sideways at each other, eyes wide, as if trying to confirm they had heard correctly. Some leaned forward, straining to catch every syllable. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was the kind of silence that crashes down when everyone realizes they are witnessing something they will never forget. From my perspective, watching the footage later, what struck me most was the stillness in the room. It was not the chaos of people shouting or reacting loudly. It was the opposite. It was as if the very air had been pulled tight, stretched to the breaking point. The absence of sound carried more power than 1,000 voices. This was not the rhythm of routine diplomacy. This was a rupture. I could almost feel what it must have been like to be in that hall. Imagine being a journalist who expected another safe quote to file and suddenly finding your fingers frozen above the keyboard. Imagine being a delegate trained to keep composure and realizing that no protocol manual prepares you for a statement like that. Even the seasoned diplomats, people who had sat through decades of summits, looked unsettled. Their posture stiffened, their glances darted nervously. A line had just been drawn in front of them, one that could not be ignored. The effect was immediate. Within minutes, clips of the ultimatum were transmitted to control rooms across the globe. In Johannesburg, in Cairo, in Nairobi, news anchors interrupted scheduled programming to replay the footage. In Washington, Paris, and Beijing, analysts huddled in studios, scrambling to interpret the meaning. And online, ordinary citizens replayed the words again and again, debating their significance, remixing them into videos, spreading them like wildfire. The ripple began in that silent hall, but by the time the sun was high over Addis Ababa, the echo had reached across oceans. What fascinates me is how simple the scene really was. No fireworks, no shouting, no grand theatrics, just a young leader standing at a podium, his voice steady, his gaze fixed, his words clear. And yet the simplicity was what made it so dramatic. There was no room to misinterpret, no diplomatic sugarcoating. It was not a request, not a negotiation. It was a line in the sand. Respect Africa, or be excluded. As I replayed the footage, I noticed the small details that made the moment unforgettable. A delegate from South Africa, sitting 3 rows back, slowly nodded. A European representative whispered hurriedly to the colleague beside him, their faces tight with unease. Journalists glanced at one another, unsure whether to stand and take notes or simply sit in stunned silence. Even the translators, accustomed to repeating every word with machine-like precision, hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing. Those little fragments of human reaction told me more than any analysis could. They revealed just how deeply the ultimatum had cut through the surface of normal diplomacy. By the end of that morning, What was supposed to be a summit about development projects had been transformed into something else entirely. Instead of infrastructure and trade, the central topic became dignity and sovereignty. Every conversation in the corridors, every question at the press conferences, circled back to the same point. Do you support Traore's demand? Do you stand with Africa's call for respect? In less than 5 minutes, he had shifted the entire agenda of the summit, and the world could not look away. That is the power of imagery and presence. A man at a podium, a hall filled with leaders, silence thick enough to feel, and a single sentence that cracked open the shield of routine. What unfolded in Addis Ababa that morning was not just a speech. It was the transformation of a summit into a defining moment. And for me, it remains one of the clearest examples of how history often announces itself quietly, then reverberates louder than anyone thought possible. What strikes me most about that morning in Addis Ababa is not just the words that were spoken, but the precision of the timing. For 4 days, Traoré said nothing while the entire continent boiled with anger over the leaked remarks. Many assumed he was cornered, afraid to confront the storm. But when he finally stepped up, it became clear the silence had been deliberate. He allowed frustration to swell, he let the anticipation build, and then he chose the stage where the spotlight was brightest. That choice turned what could have been a fleeting exchange into an earthquake that forced the world to stop and listen. The brilliance of his move lies in how he inverted expectations. Diplomacy is usually careful, calculated, wrapped in vague language. Here was a leader refusing to follow that script. No polite phrasing, no backroom deal. Instead, he delivered a sentence with the sharpness of a blade. Analysts later called it agenda setting. I call it something simpler, but more powerful. He took control of the narrative. The question was no longer whether the leaked remarks were true. The question became what Africa would do in response. In that instant, the entire conversation shifted. But let us not ignore the other side. Critics argued it was reckless. They warned that a small, landlocked country confronting a powerful nation risked isolation. They feared that investors would pull back, that relationships already fragile would fracture even more. Some saw it not as courage, but as dangerous posturing. And those criticisms cannot be brushed aside lightly. In a world where alliances are fragile and economics often decide survival, such a gamble could come at a steep price. Yet here is where the paradox lies. The very thing that made it risky also made it unforgettable. By stepping beyond the safe zone, Traoré forced attention in a way no cautious statement ever could. A safer speech might have earned polite applause, maybe a headline or two, then faded by the next day. But this ultimatum lit a fire. It sparked debates in parliaments, conversations in classrooms, protests in city squares. It became more than a demand. It became a symbol. And symbols have a life far beyond the moment they are born. The climax of this story is not found in whether Israel issued an apology. They did not. The climax is in how the ultimatum altered the balance of perception. Suddenly, leaders across the continent began to speak with a new tone. Journalists wrote not about Africa waiting for recognition, but about Africa demanding it. Diaspora communities in Harlem, in London, in Kingston carried banners quoting his words. State media in Moscow and Beijing replayed the clip to illustrate a shift in the global order. Even in Western capitals, where officials chose restraint, there was an undeniable unease. The stage had changed. From my perspective, that is the lasting power of the moment. It was not about victory or defeat in the traditional sense. It was about redefinition. Traoré reframed the conversation from grievance to ultimatum, from complaint to command. And even if the response he sought never came, the world had already been forced to adjust its gaze. That is why, in my eyes, the true high point of this drama is not the sentence itself, but the silence that followed it. The stunned hall, the journalists frozen mid-keystroke, the delegates whispering in hurried tones. That silence was the sound of recognition. It was the acknowledgement that a threshold had been crossed and there was no going back. When I replay that scene, I cannot help but feel the tension tighten in my chest. The gamble was enormous. The risk, undeniable. But history rarely belongs to those who play it safe. It belongs to those who risk ridicule, who risk failure, in order to carve out a place for their voice. Whether one calls it boldness or recklessness, the fact remains. For a brief moment, The world could not look away from Africa. That was the true climax. Not the demand itself, but the reality that the demand had already succeeded in making dignity impossible to ignore. And so, while some still debate whether it was too much too soon, I see it as something else. A strike of dignity, sharp and uncompromising, that turned a leak of disrespect into a declaration of sovereignty. That is why the scene in Addis Ababa will be remembered. Because once a voice has broken through the noise, it cannot be unheard. Once a hall has fallen silent in recognition, history has already been made. When I step back and look at the aftermath of Addis Ababa, I realize the ultimatum was never just about one leader challenging another. It was about something larger, something that touched every corner of the globe. From the crowded streets of Ouagadougou to the neighborhoods of Harlem, from student debates in Nairobi to quiet offices in Brussels, the echo of those words reached far beyond the summit hall. What began as a single sentence in one city became a mirror in which the entire world saw Africa differently. That is the extraordinary part of this story. A nation often described as small and struggling suddenly stood at the center of international attention. Traore's words carried the weight of every African who has ever felt dismissed, ignored, or sidelined in conversations that shaped their future. Whether you agreed with his ultimatum or not, you could not deny that it forced dignity into the center of the discussion. It transformed abstract frustration into a living countdown, 48 hours that everyone watched as if waiting for the world to answer. And the reactions revealed a lot about our global reality. In South Africa, a minister wrote simply, "Finally, someone said it." In London, members of the African diaspora held signs declaring respect for Africa as they marched. In Jamaica and in Harlem, the ultimatum was embraced as more than politics. It was seen as a continuation of struggles for recognition and justice that span generations. Across social media platforms, millions repeated the phrase, "Africa is not your pawn," until it became impossible to scroll without seeing it. This was no longer about one leader's demand. It had become a continental conversation that pulled in voices from every direction. Of course, the risks were real. Investors worried. Diplomats whispered about consequences. Skeptics insisted the boldness would backfire. But here is the deeper truth. Even if the immediate costs were high, the symbolic value could not be erased. For the first time in years, Africa was not waiting for approval. It was not reacting to an agenda set elsewhere. It was speaking first and demanding to be answered on equal terms. That shift, once made, cannot easily be reversed. For me, the power of Addis Ababa lies not in the outcome of those 48 hours, but in what they revealed. They showed us a glimpse of a different future, one where Africa does not ask to be included, but builds its own table and expects others to show respect if they wish to sit down. They reminded the world that dignity is not granted from the outside. It is claimed from within. And once claimed, it sets a precedent that others can follow. This is where the story moves beyond one summit and into the realm of legacy. Will other leaders take inspiration and speak with the same directness, or will they retreat back into cautious language? Will regional organizations seize the momentum and transform themselves into stronger defenders of sovereignty, or will they remain hesitant and slow to act? These are the questions that will shape the coming years. And they matter not just for Africa, but for the global order itself. Because when one part of the world asserts its voice with such clarity, every other part must adjust. What I find most powerful is how ordinary people responded. Shopkeepers in Burkina Faso repeated the ultimatum word for word as if it belonged to them. Students in Nigeria debated what it meant for their generation. Protesters in New York carried portraits of Thomas Sankara alongside images of Traoré, connecting past struggles to present defiance. It was as if history itself was reminding us that dignity is never handed down. It is always fought for. And once people feel that spark, they do not easily let it go. So here is my question to you. Do you see this as a reckless gamble or as the opening of a new chapter? Was it a fleeting burst of defiance or the beginning of a sustained movement that will reshape Africa's place in the 21st century? I cannot give you the final answer because history has not finished writing this chapter. But I can tell you that silence is no longer an option. The ultimatum has already been spoken, and the world has already heard it. If this moment stirred something in you, if it made you rethink what power and respect truly mean, then let us not let it fade. Share your thoughts, question boldly, and join the conversation. Because whether you believe it was brilliance or recklessness, one truth is undeniable. A line was drawn in Addis Ababa, and once drawn, it cannot be erased. Africa's voice has entered the room. The only question now is how loudly it will continue to speak. And I invite you to stay with us, reflect on it, and help keep this dialogue alive. In reflecting on what happened in Addis Ababa, it becomes clear that history does not always turn on wars or treaties. Sometimes it turns on a single sentence, delivered with calm determination at exactly the right moment. Captain Ibrahim Traore's ultimatum was more than a challenge to one leader. It was a declaration that dignity itself is not negotiable. By standing on a stage meant for ordinary discussions of trade and development, he transformed the summit into a platform for sovereignty, forcing the world to pause and pay attention. What makes this story so compelling is not only the words, but the strategy behind them. 4 days of silence, 4 days of letting frustration rise, followed by a clear demand at the precise time when every camera was watching. That is not just a reaction. That is the art of turning insult into opportunity. The echoes of that moment reached far beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa, people in marketplaces and universities repeated the ultimatum as their own. Diaspora communities from Harlem to London marched with banners and portraits, linking the words of Traoré to the legacy of leaders like Sankara and Mandela. On social media, millions repeated the phrase until it became a global trend. Governments debated quietly, analysts speculated loudly, but no one could pretend it had not happened. The ultimatum shifted the balance of how Africa was perceived. Even without the apology it demanded, it succeeded in reminding the world that Africa does not wait for permission to speak. It speaks for itself. From my perspective, the lesson here is powerful. Silence is often seen as weakness, but in the right hands, it can be a weapon. By holding back until the world was ready to listen, Traoré turned a response into a statement of principle. In our own lives, the same truth applies. Not every insult requires an immediate reaction. Not every slight deserves instant defense. Sometimes the most effective way to answer is to wait, to let the weight of the moment grow, and then to speak when your voice will carry the greatest impact. This is not about politics alone. It is about the way we live, the way we protect our dignity, and the way we choose when to fight for it. For me personally, this story is a reminder that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is quiet, patient, and perfectly timed. In a world full of noise, where everyone is quick to respond, the ability to wait for the right moment is rare. And when used wisely, it can change not only how others see you, but how you see yourself. So as you think about this story, I want to leave you with a simple question. How do you personally choose when to stay silent and when to finally speak up? I would love to hear your perspective, so please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments so others can also reflect on them. And if you found value in this reflection, I kindly ask you to subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you thoughtful stories and powerful lessons in the future.